I set out early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I thought I might need. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that only comes in the early hours before the sun has had its chance to warm the world. The trailhead was empty, just as I expected it to be on a weekday. That was one of the reasons I picked this route. A long, winding path through a dense forest, with no major attractions or scenic overlooks that would draw crowds. Just miles of trees, hills, and solitude. I planned this trip for weeks. I wanted to challenge myself to push past my comfort zone. I wasn't new to hiking, but I usually stuck to well-traveled trails. This one, though, was different. It wasn't completely off the grid, but it was isolated. The nearest town was an hour's drive away, and there was no cell service past the first few miles. That didn't bother me. I liked the idea of being alone, of moving through nature with nothing but my thoughts. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-maintained, cutting through thick undergrowth. I could hear birds overhead, the occasional rustling of small animals darting through the brush. It was peaceful. I made good time, covering about 5 miles before stopping for a break near a small creek. I refilled my water bottle, ate a protein bar, and checked my map. Everything was going exactly as planned. It wasn't until early afternoon that I started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious. No strange noises, no eerie silence, nothing that set off any immediate alarms. Just a vague sense that something wasn't quite right. I chalked it up to being alone in the woods. The human brain isn't built for isolation, and I knew that sometimes being alone for too long could mess with your head. I shook it off and kept walking. The further I went, the stronger the feeling got. I stopped a few times, listening, trying to pinpoint what was bothering me. But the woods sounded the same. Birds, wind, the distant sound of running water. Nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp. I found a relatively flat area near a stream, surrounded by thick trees that would help block the wind. It was a good spot, hidden, quiet, and not too far off the trail. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and made dinner. As the sun set, I tried to relax. I told myself that I was just psyching myself out, that I was fine. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound had me on edge. I kept waking up, listening, convinced I was hearing something moving outside my tent. A few times, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the trees, but I never saw anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Morning came and I felt like hell. My muscles ached, my head was foggy, and my nerves were shot. But I wasn't about to turn back. I packed up and kept going. The feeling of unease hadn't left me, but I forced myself to push forward. The trail grew steeper, winding up the side of a ridge. My legs burned as I climbed, and sweat dripped down my back despite the cool air. Then I saw it. About 20 feet off the trail, in a small clearing, was a pile of bones. At first, I thought they were animal remains, maybe a deer or an elk. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted. These weren't just random bones scattered by scavengers. They were arranged, stacked. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. The bones were clean, too clean. No signs of weathering, no bits of fur or sinew. Just white, polished bone. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever had done this was still nearby. I backed away, forcing myself to stay calm. I needed to leave. Now, I turned back toward the trail and started walking, my pace quicker than before. I kept my eyes forward, resisting the urge to look back. I didn't want to know if something was watching me. As the day stretched on, the unease only grew. The trail felt different, like it had shifted overnight. I checked my map repeatedly, but something wasn't right. I should have reached a fork in the trail hours ago. but it never came. The landscape didn't look familiar anymore. Had I taken a wrong turn? No, that wasn't possible. The trail was clear. There were no side paths, no intersections. But somehow I was lost. Panic started to creep in. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't inexperienced. I knew how to navigate. I just needed to stay calm and think. I pulled out my compass, checked my bearings, and kept moving. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not the distant rustling of animals. These were deliberate, heavy, human. I froze. My heart pounded in my ears. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I wasn't alone. A surge of adrenaline hit me and I moved. Fast. I didn't care if I was going the right way anymore. I just needed to put distance between myself and whoever was out there. I hiked for hours, barely stopping to rest. My legs ached. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. As the sun dipped lower, I finally saw something familiar. A broken signpost. I passed it yesterday. Relief flooded me. I was back on track. I wasn't lost. I could make it out. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dirt near the sign, were fresh footprints. Large, heavy, and unmistakably human. I wasn't the only one who had been lost. Or maybe I hadn't been lost at all. Maybe someone had been guiding me the whole time. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my pack inside, started the engine, and peeled out of the parking lot without looking back. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I checked the map again, tracing the lines with my finger. The route looked straightforward. Just follow the main trail, cross the creek, then take a left at the fork to loop back around before dark. Simple enough. The air smelled like pine, and the dirt trail beneath my boots felt solid, well worn. I had hiked plenty of times before, but this was my first time alone on a new trail. It was supposed to be a day hike, just a few miles in and out. No reason to overthink it. The first part of the hike was easy. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long streaks across the ground. The air was crisp but comfortable. I could hear birds somewhere off in the distance. A woodpecker tapped at a tree. A squirrel darted across the trail, stopping just long enough to look at me before disappearing into the brush. I made good time, covering the first 2 miles without trouble. The trail sloped gently upward, winding through thick forest. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you forget about everything else. I reached the creek around noon. The water was clear, moving steady over smooth rocks. I crouched down, splashing some water on my face, letting the cold wake me up a little. Felt good. I sat for a minute, drinking from my bottle, enjoying the silence. Then I noticed something. On the other side of the creek, there was a backpack, just sitting there, propped against a tree. It looked worn, dirty, like it had been there for a while. I stood up, staring at it. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no footprints in the mud, no rustling in the trees, just the backpack. I waited a little longer, scanning the woods, expecting someone to show up, to walk out from behind a tree and grab their bag. But nobody did. I told myself it wasn't my problem. People left things behind all the time. Maybe they lost it. Maybe they ditched it. I didn't need to get involved. I stepped onto the rocks, crossing the creek carefully. My boots slipped slightly, but I made it across without getting wet. Now that I was closer, I could see the backpack was old, sun-bleached. The zippers were halfway open, revealing crumpled clothing inside. I hesitated, then nudged it with my foot. It was heavier than I expected. I bent down, gripping the straps, and pulled it open a little more. A jacket, a water bottle, half empty, pair of dirty socks, and a wallet. I pulled it out, flipping it open. The ID inside was faded, the plastic worn at the edges. A man's face stared back at me, younger than I expected, probably mid-20s. The name didn't mean anything to me. I looked around again. "Hello," I called, my voice breaking the quiet. Nothing. The trees just stood there, the wind barely moving the branches. Something felt wrong. I put the wallet back and stepped away from the backpack, feeling a sudden urge to leave. I didn't know why, but I didn't want to be here anymore. I walked faster, picking up my pace as I followed the trail. The fork wasn't far. I just had to get back on track. But then I saw another one, another backpack, sitting just off the trail, half hidden in the underbrush. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same as the first one. Old, dirty. I felt my hands start to sweat. Something was wrong. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. No people.
No sounds.
Just the woods, stretching out in every direction. I kept moving. Faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. The sun had shifted, dipping lower. The light had changed, turning everything a dull shade of orange. I checked my watch. It wasn't late. I still had plenty of time, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I needed to get out of here. I reached the fork in the trail and turned left, just like the map said. The path was narrower here, the trees pressing closer. I walked fast, almost jogging. My heartbeat was steady, but my stomach was tight. Then I saw something ahead. A third backpack, just sitting there in the middle of the trail. This one was open, completely dumped out. Clothes scattered. A flashlight cracked. A pair of shoes covered in dirt. And a knife lying in the middle of the path. I froze. A noise somewhere behind me. A rustling sound, soft but unmistakable. I turned sharply, my breath stuck in my throat. Nothing. I didn't wait. I started running. The trail blurred beneath my feet, my boots pounding against the dirt. I didn't care if I tripped, didn't care if I got lost. I just had to get out. Branches scraped my arms, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. The trees seemed closer now, the light fading faster than it should. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until I saw the parking lot through the trees, my car sitting exactly where I left it. I fumbled with the keys, yanking the door open, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the sound of it roaring to life the only thing keeping me from losing it completely. I peeled out of there, tires kicking up dust, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. Didn't stop until I was miles away. Only then did I pull over, my hands still gripping the wheel. I checked my phone. No signal. I sat there for a long time, breathing, trying to steady myself. I thought about the backpacks, the wallets, the knife, and the feeling that someone, somewhere, had been watching me. I never went back to that trail. I never looked up the name on that ID. And I never, ever hiked alone again. I checked the weather twice before leaving, packed extra water, a first aid kit, and even threw in an emergency blanket just in case. The hike was about 12 miles round trip, a loop through a dense stretch of forest that I had read about online. People called it a hidden gem, a place where few hikers went because it was too remote, too wild. That's exactly why I wanted to go. I liked hiking alone. The first few miles were beautiful. Tall pines stretched high above me, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. The trail was narrow but well-worn, with soft dirt under my boots. I had my GPS tracking on, but I barely needed it. The path was clear. I moved steadily, enjoying the quiet. No sounds of cars, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirp of birds overhead. Around mile 4, the terrain changed. The trees were thicker here, blocking more of the light. The air felt cooler, damp even, like there had been a recent rain, though I knew there hadn't. The ground softened underfoot, and I saw patches of moss spreading across the rocks. I noticed the quiet then, no more birds, no more rustling. Just my breathing and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. Felt off, but I kept going. At mile 5, I saw the first sign that something was wrong. The trail ahead was torn up, like something heavy had been dragged across it. Clumps of dirt were scattered, along with broken branches. At first, I thought it was from a downed tree, maybe a storm had rolled through recently. But there were no fallen trees nearby, just the torn up ground. I hesitated but pushed forward. The sun was still high. If I kept my pace, I'd be back before dark. Mile 6, that's when I found the deer. It was fresh. The body was torn open, the ribs showing. Blood soaked the dirt, still bright red. I wasn't new to seeing dead animals on trails, but this wasn't roadkill. This wasn't decay. This was fresh. Too fresh. There were no flies yet, no smell of rot. And worse, there were no scavengers.
No birds, no insects.
Nothing. A bear, I told myself. Maybe a mountain lion. But something felt wrong about it. The way the deer's legs were sprawled, the deep gashes running along its side. I looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, nothing. I had bear spray with me, a knife too, but neither felt like enough. I moved quickly past the carcass, my heartbeat picking up. Mile 7. I started to feel like I was being followed. It was just a sense at first, that tingling at the back of your neck. I kept checking behind me, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I picked up my pace, checking my GPS every few minutes. I was still on the trail, still heading the right way. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. Too large, too deep. And they weren't boot prints. They were bare feet. Human. The stride was long, longer than any normal person's. And they weren't fresh. They had been made when the ground was wet, maybe a day ago, maybe less. I crouched down, feeling my stomach tighten. The prints followed the trail. They were going in the same direction as me. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees. Still nothing. The forest was dense here, shadows stretching between the trunks. I swallowed hard and kept walking. Mile 8. The feeling was worse now. I wasn't just being followed. I was being watched. I could feel it, heavy, pressing against my skin. My breaths were coming too fast, and I had to force myself to slow down. I reached for my knife, holding it loosely in one hand. I wasn't taking chances. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, not far behind me. I turned sharply, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing, just trees, shadows. I took a step back, then another. My fingers were gripping the handle of the knife so tight my knuckles ached. I turned and kept walking. Mile 9. The trail should have started looping back by now. I checked my GPS again. Still on track, but it felt wrong. Like I had been walking for too long. The light was dimmer now, though sunset was still an hour away. The trees pressed in tighter, the path narrowing. Then I smelled it. Something rotten, something wet. I gagged, covering my nose. The smell was thick, clinging to the back of my throat. It wasn't the deer. This was different. Worse, like old meat left in the sun too long. I moved faster, nearly jogging now. Mile 10. I should have been close to the end, but I wasn't. My GPS still showed 2 miles left, but I felt like I had been walking forever. The smell hadn't faded. Then I saw the second deer. No, not a deer. Not anymore. It was in pieces, scattered across the path. The legs were torn away, the head missing. Blood soaked the dirt, thick and dark. Something was here, something close. I gripped my knife and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran. Branches whipped against my arms, my legs. The forest was a blur, shadows shifting around me. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then I saw the road. I burst out of the trees, gasping for air. My car was there, just where I had left it. I didn't stop running until I was inside, the doors locked, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life and I peeled out, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't check my GPS again. I just drove. Took me an hour to calm down. When I finally pulled over at a gas station, my hands were still trembling. I checked my phone, looking at my GPS history. I had been off trail for 3 miles, but I never left the path. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I just know I'm never hiking alone again. I left early in the morning, the air still damp from the night before. My plan was simple: a long solo hike through the national forest, following an old, less traveled trail. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, but this would be the longest and most isolated trip I'd taken so far. I packed light but smart enough water, a few energy bars, a knife, a first aid kit, and a small emergency blanket. My boots were broken in, my backpack strapped tight, and my GPS fully charged. Everything seemed set. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail cut through thick woods, the only sounds being my footsteps on the dirt and the occasional bird overhead. I felt good. I was in shape, had trained for this, and knew what I was doing. The deeper I went, the less maintained the path became. Small branches stretched across the trail, and thick roots jutted out like traps waiting to catch my foot. I stepped carefully, adjusting my pace as I went. Around midday, I reached a small clearing where I stopped to rest. The sun was high, shining through the trees in thin beams. I drank some water and checked my map. According to my plan, I was about halfway to my intended campsite. The hike had been smooth so far, no signs of other hikers, which wasn't surprising given how remote this trail was. I liked it that way. After a short break, I got moving again. The trail sloped downward, leading into a denser part of the forest. The air felt heavier here, more humid. The trees stood taller, their branches thicker, blocking out much of the sunlight. It was quieter too, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just me and my footsteps. I didn't think much of it at first. Some areas of the forest just felt different. As I walked, I started noticing little things. A tree with deep claw marks on its bark, too high to be from any small animal. A pile of rocks that looked deliberately stacked, like someone had left a marker. And then there were the footprints, deep, wide, and fresh. Too fresh. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, large, with toes spread apart like they had been walking on the balls of their feet. I knelt down to get a closer look. They didn't look right. Human, but not quite. The stride was long, much longer than mine. Something about them made my stomach tighten. I took a deep breath and kept moving. The trail became harder to follow. The undergrowth was thick, and I had to push through bushes and step over fallen logs. My GPS still showed I was on track, but the trail itself seemed to be fading. Maybe I'd made a wrong turn? I checked my map again, comparing it with the terrain around me. Everything looked right, but the path just wasn't there anymore. I decided to press forward, knowing the worst thing I could do was panic. If I kept heading in the same general direction, I'd reach the campsite eventually. I kept my eyes on my GPS, trusting it more than my instincts at this point. Then I heard it, something moving in the trees. Not wind, not a bird. Something heavy, snapping twigs and rustling leaves. I stopped walking and listened. Stopped too. My heartbeat picked up. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. Could have been a deer. Could have been anything. But something about it felt wrong. I kept moving, forcing myself not to rush. The last thing I needed was to trip and injure myself out here. The sound came again, closer this time. I turned my head quickly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was following me, but all I saw was trees. It was stalking me. I was sure of it now. I adjusted my backpack straps and picked up the pace. My breath was coming faster. I told myself to stay calm. If it was an animal, it would lose interest. If it was a person, I didn't let myself finish that thought. Minutes passed. I walked fast but controlled. The sound followed, sometimes close, sometimes further back, always just out of sight. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? No, bears don't stalk like that. A cougar? Possible, but they usually attack from behind, not follow for this long. Person? That was the worst possibility. Person out here, barefoot, not saying a word. Then I saw something up ahead, another clearing. Relief washed over me. Open spaces were safer. I hurried toward it, my legs aching from the fast pace. When I stepped out into the clearing, I turned quickly to look behind me. Nothing, just the trees, dark and still. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, but I could no longer hear anything moving. I forced myself to take deep breaths. My hands were shaking, my muscles tense. I decided to take a few minutes to collect myself. I checked my GPS again, still on track. If I kept moving, I could reach my campsite within an hour. I didn't want to spend the night out here, but if I had to, I needed to be in a defensible spot. I looked around the clearing. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a tent, an old, abandoned tent, collapsed and torn, as if someone had left in a hurry. Around it, the remains of a small campfire, long since cold. Scattered gear, some broken, some intact. A backpack half open with clothes spilling out. I moved closer, stepping carefully. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, just a camp that had been left behind. The footprints were here too, circling the tent, deep in the dirt. They led back into the trees. My mouth was dry. My gut told me to leave. Now, I turned and started walking, forcing myself not to run. The sound returned, closer, faster. It wasn't trying to stay hidden anymore. I broke into a sprint, branches whipping against my arms, my boots slamming into the dirt. The noise behind me grew louder. Footsteps, more than one set. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The trail reappeared in front of me, clearer now, as if guiding me out. My campsite was close. I could make it. Then the sound stopped. Just like that. Silence. I didn't stop running. I burst into the clearing where I had planned to camp. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely set up my tent. I didn't build a fire. I didn't eat. I just sat there, clutching my knife, listening. The forest stayed quiet all night. At sunrise, I packed my gear and left. I didn't take my planned route back. I took the most direct path out of the woods, not caring if it was harder or longer. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car. I locked the doors, turned the engine on, and drove without looking back. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I was followed by something? That I found an abandoned camp deep in the woods? That I heard footsteps but never saw who or what made them? I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. I haven't been hiking alone since. The plan was simple, a solo hike through the mountains. I wanted time away from everything, work, people, the constant noise of everyday life. I picked a trail I hadn't done before, one that was supposed to be challenging but rewarding, with breathtaking views at the summit. It was late September, the perfect time of year. Cool air, golden leaves, and the smell of earth thick in the breeze. I packed everything I needed: a map, compass, plenty of water, extra clothes, my knife, a fire starter, and enough food for 2 days. I always over-prepared. The trailhead was empty when I got there, which I took as a good sign. I liked the solitude. The first few miles were easy, a gentle climb through dense trees. Birds chattered, and leaves crunched under my boots. I felt good, alive. As I got deeper into the mountains, the trail became rougher. The trees grew closer together, and the path turned steep. I took my time, pacing myself. About 4 miles in, I stopped for a break. Sitting on a rock, I sipped water and listened. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no birds, just silence. That was the first moment I felt it, a weird unease creeping into my chest. I shook it off, blaming it on my imagination. I'd read too many stories about hikers getting lost, about people vanishing. I stood up, adjusted my pack, and kept moving. The higher I climbed, the rougher the terrain became. Thick roots tangled the path, and jagged rocks jutted out, forcing me to watch every step. The trees started thinning, revealing glimpses of the valley below. I checked my map. Another 2 miles to go. Then I saw it. A boot print. Not mine. Fresh. Someone else was up here. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't passed another car at the trailhead. That wasn't unusual, but something about the print unsettled me. It was deep, pressed hard into the damp soil. Whoever left it was either carrying a heavy pack or moving fast. I told myself it didn't matter. Just another hiker, maybe a hunter. Still, I picked up my pace. The sun was lower now, shadows stretching long across the trail. I kept climbing. I should have reached the summit by now, but the trail seemed longer than I expected. I checked my map again. It didn't make sense. I should have seen the clearing by now. Something was wrong. I turned around to backtrack to find a familiar marker. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. The trail didn't look the same. I was lost. I tried to stay calm, tried to think. I had a compass. I had a map. I knew the general direction I needed to go. But no matter how I turned, the trail didn't match the map anymore. Trees I didn't remember, rocks that looked wrong. The sun was sinking fast. Then I saw the second boot print, right next to mine. My chest tightened. I listened. Nothing. Just the heavy beat of my own pulse. I swallowed hard, scanning the trees. The forest felt different now. Watching, waiting. I needed to move. I picked a direction and walked, fast but careful. My steps sounded too loud. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every shadow looked wrong. Every tree felt like it was hiding something just out of sight. Then I heard it, a twig snapping. Not mine. I froze, heart hammering. The sound had come from behind me. Slowly I turned. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I waited, barely breathing. Then another sound, closer, a rustle like something moving through the undergrowth. I wasn't alone. Panic surged through me. I took off, moving as fast as I could. My legs burned, my lungs ached. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. My brain screamed at me to stop, to listen, but fear kept me running. Then my foot caught on a root. I hit the ground hard, my knee slamming into a rock. Pain exploded up my leg. I bit back a cry and scrambled to my feet, gasping. My pack felt too heavy now, dragging me down. I couldn't stop shaking. The forest was silent again, but I knew something was out there, watching, waiting. I forced myself to move, limping now. I had to find the main trail, had to get out before dark. I checked my compass, my fingers shaking. North, just go north. I pushed forward, step by step, forcing myself to stay calm. The trees thinned. Then I saw it, a clearing. Relief flooded me. I was close. I could make it. Then I saw the campsite. Empty. Abandoned. A small fire pit, cold ashes scattered around it. Torn tent, half collapsed. A backpack, ripped open, its contents strewn across the ground. Clothes, food wrappers, a knife. No footprints leading away. No sign of where they had gone. I backed away, heart pounding. My brain screamed at me to leave. I turned and ran, ignoring the pain in my leg. I didn't stop until I saw the main trail, the worn path leading back to the parking lot. I kept going, pushing through the fear, through the exhaustion. I didn't stop until I reached my car. The lot was still empty. I locked the doors, hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, heart hammering the entire way. I still don't know what happened, who left those prints, what was in the woods with me. I just know I'm never hiking alone again. I parked my car at the trailhead just after sunrise. The lot was empty except for an old pickup truck, its paint faded and peeling. I double-checked my backpack, water, snacks, first aid kit, extra socks, a knife. Everything was in place. I locked the car and adjusted my pack, feeling the weight settle against my shoulders. The trail stretched ahead, disappearing into the dense forest. The hike was supposed to be about 10 miles, an out-and-back route to a ridge with a view of the valley below. It wasn't a popular trail, which was exactly why I picked it. I liked the quiet, the solitude. The only sound was the crunch of my boots against the dirt path and the occasional rustling of leaves as squirrels darted through the underbrush. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I walked at a steady pace, stopping now and then to drink water or take a quick break. The forest felt peaceful, the kind of place where time moved slower. Birds called from the trees, and every so often, I'd hear the distant rush of a stream. Around mile 4, the trail grew steeper. The trees pressed in closer, their branches intertwining to block out most of the sky. The sunlight filtered through in scattered patches, casting shifting shadows on the ground. The air felt heavier here, like the forest was holding its breath. I pushed forward, my legs burning with effort. Then I noticed something odd. The sounds of the forest had changed. The birds had stopped chirping. No rustling in the underbrush, just the wind moving through the trees. I paused, listening. The silence felt unnatural. I swallowed hard and kept moving, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. The trail narrowed as I climbed higher. The trees on either side leaned inward, their trunks twisted in unnatural angles. I glanced at my watch. Almost noon. I should have reached the ridge by now, but the trail just kept going. I frowned, pulling out my map. It didn't make sense. The ridge was supposed to be around mile 5. I had definitely gone farther than that. I kept walking. The trail wound through the trees, curving in ways that felt wrong. I should have been going up, but instead, the path dipped, leading me downhill. I stopped, trying to get my bearings. I wasn't lost. I had followed the only trail. There were no turnoffs, no forks, and yet, something was off. I turned around, deciding to head back. But after walking for nearly 20 minutes, I realized I wasn't retracing my steps. The landscape looked different. The trees were unfamiliar, their trunks darker, their roots exposed like grasping fingers. My stomach tightened. I knew this kind of fear, the kind that starts as a whisper in the back of your mind and grows louder with every step. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. I had a compass, a map. I could find my way back. I pulled them out, but the compass needle spun wildly before settling in the wrong direction. No matter how I turned, it refused to point north. My hands felt clammy. I checked the map again, but the lines and symbols seemed meaningless now. I tried my phone. No signal. I wasn't surprised. I hadn't expected service out here. I slipped it back into my pocket and kept walking, focusing on the trail ahead. If I kept my head straight, I could find my way back. But the trail changed. It was subtle at first, slight differences in the incline, in the placement of rocks. Then the trees looked different, gnarled and covered in deep grooves like claw marks. The dirt path grew uneven, the soil loose under my boots. My pulse quickened. I had no memory of passing these things. Then I saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were too large, too deep. Someone had walked this trail recently. Relief flooded me. If someone else was out here, I wasn't alone. I followed the prints, moving quickly. They led off the main trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I hesitated. Leaving the path was a bad idea, but something about the footprints felt intentional, like they were leading somewhere. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the trail, pushing through the dense foliage. The ground sloped downward, and I had to use my hands to steady myself against tree trunks. The air felt different here, cooler, damp. Then I saw it. A campsite, but it was wrong. The tent was torn open, its fabric shredded. A sleeping bag lay half unzipped, covered in dirt and leaves. A backpack sat nearby, partially emptied, its contents scattered. A rusted cooking pot lay overturned near the fire pit, the ashes cold. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. Something had happened here. The footprints led into the trees beyond the campsite, but I wasn't about to follow them. I crouched near the backpack, looking for any clues. A water bottle half full, a jacket torn along the sleeve, a notebook. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most of it was scribbled notes about hiking routes, supply lists, but the last entry made my blood run cold. If anyone finds this, don't follow the footprints. Don't leave the trail. It knows when you do. I dropped the notebook. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, whispering through the leaves. I had to get out of here. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground. Branches whipped against my face, cutting into my skin. I didn't care. I pushed forward, desperate to find the main trail again. Then I tripped. My foot caught on something, and I went sprawling forward, landing hard. Pain shot through my ankle. I gasped, rolling onto my side. I looked back to see what had tripped me. A boot, half buried in the dirt. A human boot, the leather worn and cracked. My stomach lurched. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and kept running. When I finally broke through the trees, I nearly collapsed in relief. The trail, the real trail. I didn't stop moving. I didn't look back. I just ran. I reached my car as the sun began to set. The old pickup was gone. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, throwing my pack into the passenger seat. I started the engine, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't want to know, but I'll never hike alone again. I started early in the morning, just as the sky was beginning to lighten. The air was cold and damp, the kind that sinks into your bones, but it felt refreshing. The forecast had called for clear skies, and I had planned for a full day of hiking. My goal was to reach the peak of a lesser-known trail deep in the mountains, a place that few ventured to because of its steep and unforgiving terrain. I had spent the last few weeks preparing, packing carefully, making sure I had enough water, food, and emergency supplies. My boots were well-worn, comfortable, and broken in from years of hiking. My backpack was heavy but balanced, packed with everything I needed, including a map and compass, just in case my GPS lost signal. The trail started off easy, a wide dirt path winding through thick woods. Birds chirped, and the morning light filtered through the leaves, casting shadows across the ground. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trail began to narrow. The trees pressed in closer, and the sounds of the world outside faded. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I was making good time, keeping a steady pace. After a couple of hours, the incline started to increase. My legs burned, but it was a familiar ache, one I had trained for. The path turned rocky, uneven, and I had to watch my footing carefully. One wrong step here could mean a twisted ankle or worse. About 4 hours in, I reached a small clearing where I decided to take a break. I set my pack down, stretched my legs, and took a long drink of water. The view was incredible. Below me, the dense forest stretched out for miles, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The sky was a deep blue, not a single cloud in sight. After a quick snack, I got moving again. The next section of the trail was the most difficult, a steep climb up a narrow ridge. It required full concentration. One side was a sheer drop, nothing but jagged rocks and open air. The other side was a near vertical rock face, rough and unforgiving. I took it slow, placing each step carefully, gripping onto the rocks when I needed to. My heart pounded, not just from the exertion but from the sheer exposure. One misstep and that was it. Halfway up the ridge, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones. They were deep, meaning whoever had made them was carrying a heavy load. I hadn't seen another soul all day, and I knew this wasn't a popular trail. It unsettled me, but I pushed the thought aside. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the top of the ridge and took a deep breath. The hard part was over, or so I thought. The trail beyond the ridge was different. It was overgrown, almost as if no one had used it in years. Thick bushes and tangled branches blocked the path, forcing me to push my way through. It was slow going, frustrating, and more than once, I thought about turning back. Then I saw it, a backpack sitting in the middle of the trail. At first, I thought someone must have dropped it, but it didn't make sense. It was positioned too perfectly upright, like it had been placed there. The straps were frayed, the fabric faded from the sun. It looked like it had been sitting there for a long time. I hesitated, glancing around. The forest was silent now, too silent. The birds had stopped chirping, the wind had died down. An uneasy feeling crept over me. I stepped closer and nudged the backpack with my boot. Tipped over easily, and the moment it did, I knew something was wrong. The zippers were open, the contents spilled out. A water bottle half empty, a torn map, some energy bars, a flashlight. It looked like it belonged to a hiker, but there was no sign of the person who had carried it. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I glanced around again, scanning the trees, listening for any sound, any movement. Nothing. I wanted to leave, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe someone had gotten lost, abandoned their gear. Maybe they had gone ahead trying to find help. But why leave their pack behind? A part of me wanted to investigate, to follow the trail further, see if I could find any sign of the owner. But the more logical part of me knew better. I turned around and started back the way I came, moving faster than before. Every instinct in my body told me to leave. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning my surroundings, checking over my shoulder every few steps. Then I heard it, a rustling in the bushes. I froze. It was close, too close. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there, watching. I didn't wait. I picked up my pace, forcing myself to stay calm. The ridge was up ahead. I just had to get past it, make it back to the main trail. The rustling followed me, moving through the trees, keeping pace. My heart pounded. I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that. I reached the ridge and started down, my legs shaking. The drop beside me felt even more dangerous now. I kept going, focusing on my footing, refusing to look back. By the time I reached the bottom, the rustling had stopped. The silence was worse. I forced myself to keep moving, step after step, refusing to slow down. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, until I was back at my car. I yanked the door open, threw my pack inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trees stood still, silent, like they had never moved at all. I never found out who the backpack belonged to. I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again.